what today's topic is primarily going to be about is muscle protein synthesis, anabolic resistance, and we will go into at least an ACL injury study, just as an example of some of the literature that's out there. Let's check out, see what we got going on. All right, well, I'd say that's pretty good for now. Anybody else can watch this always on the back end. So, the number one issue in any injury-related scenario is going to be disuse. That means I've got to take some downtime with good reason. If I just hurt myself, let's say it was a ligament sprain, right? Well, ligaments attach bone to bone. So if that passive joint structural piece of material is not doing its job, well, the joint's not going to be as stable. If I keep pushing on it, I may make things worse. That should make sense. Same thing if I damage a muscle or a tendon. Those pieces of tissue contract and transmit loads respectively, so I may further injure them as well. And then obviously if I fractured a bone, it really makes no sense to be loading it. So through the normal course of the last, let's say, centuries worth of looking at anatomy and muscle physiology, and now leading into probably the last, let's say maybe 4 decades of just giving us some very solid information on where mechanistically the problem lies, we can see that in a nutshell, muscle protein synthesis has by far one of the biggest attributes for longevity of life, but also recovery from anything. That could be from exercise or from this injury. So as we put here on the board, if you can see it, let me actually see if it's big enough that you guys can read that. I guess that's big enough. Comment if you need me to get a little closer. All right? So, you're welcome for putting this on, man. There should be one daily. I'll just pick different topics from it just before I work out. I'll always do one of these. So, with any injury, there's typically a decrease in activity, as I stated. This decrease is usually seen in the medical world as a period of disuse or immobilization. We can see that very shortly within a 2-week period. Muscle protein synthesis will typically drop synthetically on the average of about 30%. Now, what does that actually mean in a practical sense? It usually means a drop of about 350 grams of muscle in that limb. And a lot of these studies have been done looking at the quadricep with a knee immobilizer so that they can more accurately assess it. But mind you, muscle protein synthesis is global, happens throughout the whole body. So respectively, if I'm not, say I'm a soccer player, I injure my ACL, and I'm not running or lifting weights anymore for my legs, but now I've also stopped for my body, you can also consider that I'm losing some muscle mass elsewhere, which would equate to just a loss of body weight, right? But that 350 grams of muscle loss, which a good surrogate measure is actually the weight, or the let's say the weight of a human heart, right? The size of your fist, equates to about 30% drop in strength. Now, this term right here is a part of the process that eventually leads us into what we call anabolic resistance. It's when we have a drop in fractional protein synthetic rate and a drop in strength. Because mind you, if I've dropped in the amount of protein synthesis, and that can also mean just maintenance. This doesn't always mean making more, but a lot of times, because protein synthesis is combating protein breakdown, which we'll get into in a moment, it means just maintenance a lot of times. But anabolic resistance is a term that we're using now to describe these two key factors here, a loss in fractional protein synthetic rate and a loss in strength. Now, typically, anabolic resistance is something we actually see on a common basis with our elderly population. Why? A lot of it has to do with the body's resistance over a period of time to obviously anabolic hormones, the insufficient ingestion of higher quality proteins, which contain specific amounts of certain key amino acids, but also the fact that they are not physically exposing themselves to stress. Because mind you, when we're adults, we require exercise and diet to spur protein synthesis. So if I'm hurt and I'm not lifting, that knocks off one leg. And if I'm not eating well enough, that locks off the other. And that's how the body, although in a young person, in a young person's body, let's say, or in a younger state, how I can mimic very much the same effects that are seen in an elderly person with anabolic resistance. Now, if we look at this, it may be kind of difficult for you to see. Let me get the camera closer to it. I want to completely undo this. All right. So, in a normal level, the dotted line represents muscle protein breakdown, with the solid line representing muscle protein synthesis. On normal everyday activity, there is usually a point of building and a point of breaking that, when looked at, the difference equates to what we call the net protein balance. Now, typically we'd want to be on the positive side, where we've actually improved on muscle protein synthesis, but it wouldn't be bad to also be on the neutral side, right? Fearing that the other alternative would be more on the muscle protein breakdown. Now, historically, there has been some confusion on what happens after an injury. We do know that after an injury, which leads to disuse, the initial stages of the injury will have additional protein breakdown. The same can be seen when we're exercising under heavy load, where muscle protein breakdown, in fact, I'm going to grab my marker here. Muscle protein breakdown, if I divide this area in half, and I'll say this is a heavy intensity exercise model, muscle protein breakdown, in fact, does increase a little bit more. We term that proteolysis, right, or the breakdown of protein. And this is normal. This is actually what eventually leads to DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, right? But after a period of time and the inflammatory process has stopped, the disuse on a fractional level decreases the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So it's not that breakdown accelerates anymore over a period of time. It's that I'm simply not meeting the proper requirements of either exercise or dietary intake of protein to stimulate any sort of significant muscle protein synthesis to occur. Now, consider in a normal diet, right, where I'm consuming at least a minimum of 100 grams of protein a day, preferably broken up into about 30 to 35 grams, right, per meal, which, let's just say you had 3 meals a day. You'd see how you get to that number. And understanding that as I get older, into even the later 40s to 60s, that requirement may actually be closer to about 40 to 50 grams at a single serving, just to significantly meet threshold. If I'm below any of those values, meaning, let's say, for example, for breakfast I had 2 eggs, 6 grams of protein, and I had a sandwich for lunch, maybe it had 20 grams of protein. Well, if I haven't exercised and increased the sensitivity of the muscle to the amino acid intake, those proteins are probably sub-max, or let's say not sub-max, let's say below threshold. So that below threshold amino acid ingestion, specifically of leucine, would not trigger this normal dietary rise of protein synthesis. So I would have really spent most of my day really not putting this in any sort of favorable position. But let's look at exercise now, because that's the other way that human beings can increase muscle protein synthesis. So a single bout of exercise can actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis on a fractional rate to increase. And it does so by basically increasing mTOR, C1 specifically in the muscle, but also by down-regulating, like we spoke about the other day, myostatin, equally associated with different sorts of hormones like growth hormone, IGF-1, and to a degree, testosterone. So exercise can play a really prominent role, and the combination of the two, which we're learning more and more now with our understandings of peri-workout nutrition, meaning optimal nutrition before, during, and after to help and decrease some of the catabolic effects of protein breakdown, like that occur under high-intensity training, essentially digging a more shallow hole, not so deep, right, by the ingestion of essential amino acids. And obviously post-workout nutrition, but overall hitting the daily requirements of at least 100 grams of protein a day. Anywhere above that is really where we want optimally for our athletes. That's what's going to make the biggest difference here. Now, historically, we've had this conversation where rehab sits in this low-load world. Myself and other therapists included. I think I actually saw John Russin join up, so it's good to have JR with us. Kind of cut from the same cloth in terms of our hybrid models for really applying exercise physiology to rehab. But if we look at rehab in general in a traditional sense, low-load training, which means training that's typically at a sub-max level, so anywhere below 60% of a 1 RM, has shown us to have a very minimal effect at increasing muscle protein synthesis or the activation of mTOR. Now, the reason for that has a lot to do with certain types of muscle fiber recruitment, namely fast twitch motor units. Because if I'm in the low load world, right, I typically tend to stay within the Krebs cycle, which means that I can optimally utilize oxygen, and I can combine it with sugar, which is a 6-carbon, right? Sugar, or we'll say glucose, 6-carbon structure, and together I can make stuff like pyruvate, and with pyruvate I can then make a lot of ATP. But the Krebs cycle world requires oxygen. And in a low-load scenario, I'm typically going to be in an oxygen-dependent world, an aerobic world where I'm utilizing slow-twitch muscle fibers to do the demands, to make ATP. Well, we've seen that this just isn't enough to do the job. But if we add into account that my protein ingestion may be below threshold, specifically for an injured athlete, this is critical. The protein consumption is critical because we have to alter caloric intake to respect the output. Carbohydrates are an awesome form of energy, but the more simple they are, the higher likelihood we are of inducing anabolic resistance via inducing insulin resistance. Because mind you, insulin is what helps to drive glucose into the cell, which a lot of times we would like to have happen at the muscle and not at the fat cell, and obviously not at tumorous cells, because muscle is the organ of glucose disposal. We want that muscle to uptake as much as it can possible. But in an injured state where I can't sufficiently utilize stored glycogen in the muscle to a point where the replenishment would keep my insulin levels low and my insulin levels spike and I become all slightly diabetic, and I'm ingesting protein below a threshold, I'm not really activating mTOR either. So now I've run into a scenario just like, where are we at here? Just like this, right? or I'm not optimal